Okay, so let's go ahead and look at the Valiant case. Valiant Pharmaceuticals. A little bit on the background of this company. A multinational specialty pharmaceutical and medical device company. Its headquarters are in Quebec. From the website devoted to improving people's lives through our healthcare products. This is the former CEO. He resigned in the wake of the scandals and issues that I'll talk about momentarily. Quick SWOT analysis on the company. 7,500 employees in the organization and 900 product lines. So this is a pretty sizable, although not an enormous, biopharmaceutical company. Most biopharmaceutical companies tend to be smaller. J&J, Pfizer, Merck, those are exceptions, not the rule. Weaknesses, they don't have much of a presence in emerging markets. They're largely dependent upon America for their revenue generation. Okay, and for that reason, healthcare reforms in the United States could be potential threats going forward, as well as economic slowdowns leading to reduced spending on healthcare. Opportunities include especially emerging market growth. Let me talk a little bit about what they were doing and why this company was so controversial. Okay, so they were engaging in price gouging. Now, the way pharmaceuticals work in this country, I've explained this before in class, but if a company develops a particular drug line, the government gives them patent protection for a period of time. And that might be 7 years, it might be 8 years, 10 years, 12 years, okay? And the company then has protected control over a particular drug until the patent protection expires and other companies can copy their drug and generics can flood the market. Okay, so a drug line is a very valuable thing. And Valiant specialized in orphan drugs. That is, drugs for diseases that don't really have any other treatment than the particular drug in question. Okay, so these might be neurological diseases, these might be cardiac problems, but they were diseases for which the patients didn't really have any other treatment options. Valiant did not do their own R&D. They bought drug lines from other companies. And what they did after purchasing these drug lines was increase the price. So Ciprin's yearly price went from $1,400 to $21,000, Cooperman from $900 to $26,000, Isopral from $4,500 to about $37,000. So pretty clearly they increased the price massively as soon as they purchased these drug lines. And this was very controversial. It was controversial because the people who were being treated by these drug lines didn't have any other options. And some of them died because they couldn't afford the prices that Valiant was expecting them to pay. Valiant's defense, they claimed that treatments were priced based on a range of factors, including clinical benefits and the value they bring to patients, physicians, payers, and society. Consequences, well, a lot of people could not afford to pay such high prices. A lot of sick people were not able to pay for medicines they needed to live. Additionally, Valiant company execs profited substantially, especially through stock options. The company also, in addition to the price gouging, I should note here that they faced allegations of improper accounting and that they used predatory price hikes to boost growth and try to paper over their accounting issues. Now, the topic of price gouging is what I want to focus on in this presentation because it's a controversial topic. Price gouging occurs in circumstances where the equilibrium between buyers and sellers has either temporarily or structurally become unbalanced. And by that I mean that there are far more buyers, there's much more demand for a particular product than there are sellers. And so it's possible for sellers to increase price far beyond what they would otherwise be able to do. Often, price gouging occurs when customers are in distress. This includes especially natural disasters. For instance, after Hurricane Katrina, a Florida man was charged with price gouging after renting a truck to drive up to North Carolina. The man bought 35 generators and then brought them home and sold them for almost double what he bought them for. Okay, Here's a gas station that increased its price from $3.89 a gallon to $4.79. I found this online only one day after Hurricane Irene hit. Okay, one well-known case of price gouging that went to court that I found. Mohammed Manan in 2008 offered gasoline for sale at his Tulsa, Oklahoma gas station for $3.29. He had raised the price from $2.69, an increase of 60 cents following an ice storm. Under Oklahoma law, once an emergency has been declared, business owners cannot artificially raise the price of necessary goods and services more than 10% above the pre-emergency price. So ultimately, Manon was charged and convicted. Now, definitely there are arguments against price gouging. So one straightforward argument is that it exploits the poor, the needy, and the suffering. Think of the people who were price gouged by Valiant with their rare and debilitating diseases. Okay, and the idea here in the argument is that when people are most in need of help, it is unethical to charge them more just because you know they are in need. After all, the last thing you should be doing as a business person is reaping a short-term economic advantage at the expense of your ethical values and long-term business success. And to be honest, actually, people tend to remember who was price gouging when they were in distress, and they try not to frequent such a business going forward in the future. The examples that I've given here of price gouging are examples of temporary imbalances in the buyer-seller equilibrium. You remember your micro classes and the graph of the buyer-seller equilibrium, right? The temporary imbalance leads to asymmetric power advantages for sellers over buyers. But the Valiant case is more of a structural imbalance, because this is a case where legal protection was given to a company for control of orphan drug lines, which could no longer be obtained, or which could never be obtained by customers from another location. Now, having said these things against price gouging, there are actually arguments for price gouging. Here are two such arguments. One straightforward argument, the most common one, is that higher prices increase supply. Consider Hurricane Harvey. If the price of generators increases enough, people from other states like Oklahoma or Louisiana might drive to Houston to sell their generators. Okay, and if you think about it for a minute, if the price is high enough, there are going to be strong incentives in place for sellers to alter their existing product lines and either to produce more of the product in question or to obtain more of the product in question so as to increase their profits. So some would argue that actually price gouging is an example of market functionality operating as it ought. This is because when markets are left free to operate as they please without external intervention from government regulators, they will, where possible, again reach equilibrium between buyers and sellers in a manner that is equitable to all, because sellers will be so motivated to compete with each other that they will drive the price down back to pre-tragedy levels. Here's a second argument in favor of price gouging. Higher prices restrict demand to the most valuable uses. Some might want water because they are dying of thirst, obviously a very valuable use. Others, though, might want it to boil noodles, take a shower, or wash their clothes, obviously less valuable uses. As the price increases, people stop using water for frivolous things and start selling water to each other. Okay, so the high price of the product maximizes efficiency in usage of the product. To summarize then, some economists see price gouging as simply an example of the laws of supply and demand working as they should. Those would advocate allowing prices to rise in the wake of tragedies. Like the recent ice storm, for instance, saw prices per kilowatt hour rise to 9,000, which is the maximum per kilowatt hour in Texas. That is an example of government regulation setting a cap on prices, but that was far higher than the normal price. So the state of Texas did allow prices to rise quite a bit. Others see price gouging as exploitation of needy people, especially in circumstances in which those people are particularly vulnerable following tragedies or due to circumstances outside of their control, like in the orphan diseases case. So the question is, who is right here? What do we think of the topic of price gouging? Is it always indefensible Is it always defensible? Is it sometimes defensible and sometimes not? What do we think of this particular topic? Good or bad depending on the situation. Thank you. How so? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Terrific. Yeah. So notice that if price is capped artificially in the wake of a natural disaster, product supply will run out very quickly. So if bottled water is capped at $3 per set or whatever, a little above, maybe the state lets it rise a little above what it otherwise would be, but not too much. Bottled water is going to go out pretty quickly after something like Hurricane Harvey. If bottled water is allowed to rise naturally to maybe $60 per set at the grocery store, pretty high, right? But still, if you have $60 and it's worth it to you, it could be argued that that is a fair price. Then pretty quickly, a new supply is going to come flooding in and will bring things back to equilibrium very fast. Okay, but at the same time, Isabella mentions that it doesn't really seem to be fair when people are suffering from circumstances outside of their control for them to be hit with prices that are debilitating to their own economic well-being, like Valiant's drug prices. So is there a principle here, supposing, I think, like many of us probably think that maybe there are forms of price gouging that are more defensible than others, is there a principle here that can be used to separate good and bad or better or worse forms of price gouging from each other? That's a great principle, Diana. Thank you. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Price gouging being acceptable when item, a good or service when it's a want versus a need.
Yeah, I love that principle. I think you're right. My own intuition is definitely in line with yours right there.
That's a good point.
Mhm.
But the water bottle could also typically be considered a need.
Mhm.
Water to drink.
Sure.
But if
Okay.
something's that are a want and a need, then what do you do then?
Yeah, and it might be a want for some people and a need for others. Yeah. So presumably, someone living on River Oaks Boulevard would be much more capable of affording the water in the aftermath of the tragedy, but it wouldn't necessarily be a need for them. It would probably be a want because they might have other sources, whereas the rest of us would have to just sort of shove it. But we got to start somewhere, and I think that the need-want distinction is a great place to start. Maybe it's more defensible when it has to do with goods or services or resources that are wants rather than those that are needs, especially those that are life-threatening needs. Okay? So most people's intuition when they encounter something like the Valiant case is this company was way out of bounds and should not have been doing that. And it was a big scandal, and they actually had to change their name because they came under a lot of government pressure because basically the regulators told them they were going to put them out of business if they kept doing this. But at the same time, you kind of want market forces to be at play in the aftermath of natural disasters so that people will drive to bring the generators and do other things to help the people who are in need. So maybe alongside the need-want distinction, we could find a middle-of-the-road policy in certain circumstances where price is allowed to rise to some extent, so there is incentive there, market forces, right? But not so much that is completely out of the realm of possibility when it comes to individual purchasers.
We will have a cap then.
A cap might be a good idea, yeah. So you don't want to exclude market forces entirely, but at the same time, if markets are allowed to operate without regulation, then in circumstances where some people suddenly become really, really weak, one counterparty becomes asymmetrically weak, the other counterparty can absolutely destroy them, like in the aftermath of a natural disaster. And you don't want that either. So maybe sometimes it could be argued that market mechanisms break down. I'm not a market fundamentalist. I think markets work most of the time, but sometimes maybe market mechanisms do break down. And in circumstances like that, we allow the market forces to work, but cap it after a certain point when it's beyond the ability of a reasonable person to pay. I don't know, I'm just floating ideas out there. There's not necessarily a right or wrong answer here. Anybody else on the need-want distinction or on when price gouging might be defensible and when not? Okay. Cool. All right, let's leave it at that then. If you'll pull out your business ethics and action texts, we're going to try to catch up today on some topics that we're still a little bit behind on. So if you'll look on page 198 and 199, I want to say a couple summary things about virtues and the kinds of virtues that we should seek to manifest in business. I'm going to motor through this chapter real fast because we're a little bit behind and I want to try to catch up a bit today. But what was going on in the Tyco case in this chapter? Can someone summarize for us what this Kozlowski dude was doing in the Tyco case? This is chapter 9. Elijah, do you have the text open? Can you tell us what was going on in the Kozlowski case? If not, that's cool. I can call in somebody. Yeah, you got to shout, man. You're talking through your mask. Yes, so among many other things. Yep. Great, thank you. Yeah, so he was helping himself to the company's funds is what he was doing on a vast and lavish scale. So he evaded taxes, yeah.
Bought a trip for his fiance
Mm-hmm.
and some artwork with the company fund.
Used company funds to pay for antiques, art, and other furnishings. This became a loan, right? He buys a mansion in Florida using a $19 million no-interest loan, which was later treated as a special bonus. Okay, and on and on and on, right? There's this concert for his wife's birthday in Sardinia, which he uses company funds to pay for, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, I've seen cases of CEOs helping themselves to company funds, but this is pretty extreme. I don't know that I've ever seen a case that was this extreme. At any rate, the case is listed here in the text because the dude who came after him as Tyco's CEO is somebody, Breen, who had to exercise certain kinds of virtues to right the ship of the company and to organize its setup. And I want to talk a little bit about the virtues that are listed here in this chapter. They are the kinds of virtues that can't be cultivated very quickly. It takes a lifetime to develop these virtues. But once they are present in someone's character, they become very attractive virtues. And they're the sort of thing that when we see them in the lives of others, practiced in the lives of others, we naturally want to gravitate towards and follow, and we appreciate. For instance, on page 210, integrity is one such virtue. The book says here, integrity confers unity in making decisions coherent with a personal life project and in integrating various relationships into one's personal life. The opposite of integrity is corruption. In fact, corruption signifies impairment of integrity, virtue, or moral principle, and in its generic meaning signifies a lack of wholeness, a dividedness. Okay, so integrity is just being the same thing in all aspects of your life. So many people live dual lives. They're one thing on the weekends, another during the work week, or they're one thing in real life and another on the internet, or they are one thing in business and another in the rest of their lives. And integrity is the opposite of that bifurcation of life. Integrity is a holistic virtue. It is a virtue of um, maybe you could say streamlining across one's life, a certain truthfulness all across the different aspects of one's life. Once we manifest this, it is incredibly attractive to others. And in leaders, this is something that naturally makes others want to follow and want to gravitate towards. Okay, the opposite of this deception is very off-putting. And when we find it in others, we are incredibly turned off by it. But the fact that we are turned off by deception in others does not keep us from ourselves being tempted or wanting to practice it. I guess with all of these virtues, we'll talk about humility and arrogance in a minute. The temptation to do something ourselves is very great, even though when we find others who are doing that something, that, the temptation to do a certain vice ourselves is very great, even though when we find others who are doing that vice, we are incredibly turned off by them. If you look on page 212 and 213, humility is another great virtue. It takes a long time to cultivate this. Humility is not going around and saying always, I'm a worm, woe is me, I'm not worthy. Okay, somebody who is humble, genuinely humble, actually doesn't say those sorts of things. I have heard it said that a humble person doesn't speak less of himself, but speaks of himself less. And it's the sort of a trait that, again, is incredibly attractive. No one wants to be around somebody who's always talking about himself and his own accomplishments. It's really off-putting. And even though that person might be really good at what he does and maybe deservedly could talk about his own accomplishments, still the fact that he's the one doing it is very unattractive. I remember watching MJ's Hall of Fame acceptance speech, Michael Jordan, right? So when he gets accepted to the Hall of Fame, he gives this talk, and this is the worst thing I've ever seen in my life. He talked about all the people who had ever dissed him and his high school coach for not giving him enough playing time, and basically said to all of them, and look where I am now. Look what I did in spite of you. It was so off-putting. I was like, what an arrogant jerk. Now, it is MJ, right? So I guess he could say that sort of thing, but it doesn't necessarily make him the sort of person others want to be around. He's actually lost a whole bunch of money from gambling. I don't know. I guess he can always make more money because of his brand name, but his fortune is much, much smaller now than it should be because he's lost so much in gambling over the years. The opposite of humility on page 213 is arrogance, pride, conceit, or an excessive sense of personal worth. Arrogant managers deem themselves irreplaceable. They do not recognize their errors and rarely rectify their wrong behaviors. Neither do they acknowledge their own failures, but constantly lay the blame for them on others. Again, humility is very attractive and arrogance is very off-putting, but this does not belie the fact that many of us find arrogance a temptation, something that we, I guess, don't realize when it's manifested in ourselves. We don't realize that it's off-putting to others around us. It's something to think about. Several more virtues are canvassed there on pages 214 and 215, justice, honesty, and loyalty. I'm going to skip through those for the sake of time and focus just on one on page 217, self-discipline. Self-discipline is something that takes a long time to cultivate, but fortunately once cultivated is not lost very easily. It's also something that people often have in one aspect of their lives, but not in others. It's rare to meet people who are generally disciplined across all aspects of their lives. Maybe someone is self-disciplined in the area of eating, but not when it comes to sleep. Or maybe they work really hard, but are not sexually self-disciplined. When we encounter people who are self-disciplined, it is something that we want to be like. It's just a natural human tendency to want to follow or gravitate towards those who have self-discipline. because it's the sort of a virtue that leads to great accomplishment. And when people manifest it, the rest of us just naturally want to know what their secret is and how they do it. So it's something that you want to begin cultivating now. People don't wake up at 45 as middle management or upper management and suddenly manifest all of these virtues. It is something that takes a lifetime to cultivate. And so if you want to be a person of integrity at 45 or a self-disciplined person at 45, the way to do that is to make the choices now that will enable you to have those virtues in your character at that time. Are there any questions or comments about that overview chapter on virtues in leadership and business? All right, let us turn the page. I'm motoring through quickly. And let us talk about a particular case that is, I think, a case where we're going to have some disagreement here. On page 224 and 225, what's listed there is the Boeing case, and it involves a CEO, Harry Stonecipher. And can you guys look at that case, and can someone tell us what was going on in this situation? What was Stonecipher doing? Okay,